Well, good evening and welcome to our webinar. Boa noite e bem-vindos ao nosso evento. I'm Crystal Laco, I'm the chair of Coalition of Conservation, and I'm the vice chair of the Australia-Brazil Chamber of Commerce, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator tonight. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, paying my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Coalition of Conservation, we are a registered charity advocating for the protection of the environment through market-based solutions to cut carbon emissions, while still growing the economy. And the Australia-Brazil Chamber of Commerce is a membership-based organization promoting bilateral trade and investment between the two countries. And tonight we'll be discussing how Australia and Brazil are emerging as the two most prominent leading countries to a future global green energy market, given their potential to produce solar, to produce wind and large-scale green hydrogen volumes. Brazil is ranked #1 in the world in the use of hydropower. It's also the 7th in the world ranking of wind power. And its commitment to renewables has been a significant global example of how high energy demand isn't limited by the transition to sustainable energy. Brazil has committed to the net zero by 2050 target, as well as to reducing up to 43% emissions by 2030. Now in Australia, the transition to renewables has been growing continuously over the last 2 decades. 24% of Australia's electricity came from renewable energy last year. And solar is now the largest source of renewable energy at 9% of total generation. And the Morrison government is backing new generation, is backing transmission and storage projects across Australia. So tonight we'll be hearing from experts from Australia and from Brazil on the potential for these two countries to position themselves as leaders on clean energy technology and develop partnerships to create new export markets together. This is already happening with hydrogen. This year, Australia Energix has announced their support to build the world's largest hydrogen plant in Brazil. And Fortescue is also looking into building green hydrogen production plants in Brazil. So I'll be inviting each panelist to make a short presentation, then we'll go straight to a panel discussion. And I'll be asking them questions, including those from the audience. So please type your questions in the Q&A box. And this webinar will be recorded. We'll be sending the recording to everyone who registered. So let me start by introducing His Excellency Mauricio Carvalho Lírio. He's Brazil's ambassador to Australia. Ambassador Lírio is a career diplomat. He served at the Brazilian embassies in Washington before, Buenos Aires. He served at the permanent mission of Brazil to the United Nations in New York. And before coming to Australia, he was the Brazilian ambassador to Mexico. Ambassador, welcome, bem-vindo. And could you please share with us some insights on the energy landscape in Brazil?
Thank you very much, Christina. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Chamber of Commerce, the Australia-Brazil Chamber of Commerce for this invitation. In particular, Rob Grant, who is the head of the Chamber, and also you, Christina. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here for two main reasons. First, because, well, it's my conviction and my purpose to strengthen the strategic dialogue between Australia and Brazil in such important areas like energy, but also not only energy, also in agriculture, in mining. And the second reason is that I think that we have to have this dialogue with a clear green conscience and green approach. It's not only inevitable, it's desirable. And this kind of discussion on the renewable sources of energy is very important between Brazil and Australia. Well, I'll start my presentation telling a very, I would say, a very important success story in Brazil, which is exactly the question of renewable sources of energy. Few people know, but Brazil has in its mix, in its matrix of energy, an important contribution of renewable sources. The average in the world is around 14% of the participation of renewables. In the case of Brazil, we have an impressive number of 48% of renewable sources of energy, which is very impressive. It's almost 4 times the world average. And these, I would say, happened even before all the discussion on climate change, on the need to make the transition for renewables started to gain momentum in the world, because the transition of Brazil started, in fact, in the mid 70s, and accentuated its speed during the 80s and 90s. So I would say that the success story of Brazil in terms of renewable sources of energy, in a way, comes before the great momentum that the discussion on the environment and climate change had in the international debate. And this success story was born from, in fact, from a shortcoming in Brazil, the fact that Brazil was not too much endowed with large reserves of oil and gas, as contrary to other countries. The two oil crises in the 70s, the world oil crisis, the 73, 79, affected directly Brazil because we did not have large reserves. And what happened by that time was that we managed, fortunately, to transform these shortcomings, these lack of large reserves of oil and gas into a story of success in the development of a matrix which is based in large part in renewable sources of energy. For you to have an idea, in 1984, and this is the main source of renewable energy in Brazil, is the hydropower, electricity. In 1984, we inaugurated, indeed, the most important hydroelectric power in the world, which is Itaipu. By that time, it was the biggest one. After that, the Chinese built the Three Gorges Dam, which is the largest one. But Brazil decided to use natural resources that it had, in fact, a large basin of rivers, very favorable to the use of hydroelectric power. And we decided to use this to produce energy. And the result is so impressive that nowadays Brazil has in its matrix, for example, for electricity, around 80% is derived from hydroelectric power. You mentioned, Christina, that Australia has around 20%, if I'm not wrong, of wind power in its electricity matrix. But in the case of Brazil, we managed to have 80% of hydroelectric power as the source in our electricity matrix. So it's very impressive. Besides that, and it's curious because the lack of oil and gas in Brazil produced the two great revolutions in terms of the production of energy in Brazil. One was the hydroelectric power. The other one was the development of the biofuels in Brazil. This is something that few people know, but it's also an impressive story in Brazil. I'll give you an example. This week, well, I've just arrived in Australia, and I needed to buy a private car, and I went to a car dealer. If you do that in Brazil, you are going to know that most likely you're going to buy what we call a flex fuel engine, which is an engine that can be run either on gas or with ethanol, with whatever mix you have between them. So this was a development, the so-called, what we called in Brazil, the alcohol engine. The ethanol engine was a development in the 80s. And we managed, with the development of technology in Brazil about biofuels, we managed to have nowadays a flex fuel engine that can run with either one of them, and with whatever mix you have between them. If I'm more environmentally conscious consumer, I can go to a gas station and put all the tank only with complete the tank with ethanol and whatever mix you have. So we managed to have this huge advance also with biofuels. I would say that the main replacement for gas as a source of electricity in Brazil was hydropower, and I wouldn't say main replacement, because of course we cannot be I would say deprived of oil in our fleet, but we managed to have an interesting mix in which ethanol has a high percentage of the mix for running the national fleet in Brazil. Including it's mandatory according to the law in Brazil, we have to have at least 27% of ethanol in the mix that the cars use. So the gas that you're going to get in the pumps in Brazil, the gas there, the gasoline has at least 27% of ethanol. So this mix of the high power of hydropower in Brazil and the presence of ethanol, as our fuel for moving the fleet in Brazil, these two are responsible for most of the numbers that we have about these 48% of renewables in our matrix. But of course, with this large history and I would say successful history in renewables in those two examples, we are also a great power in terms of the potential of developing other renewable sources of energy. You know, Cristina mentioned Brazil as the seventh most important in terms of electricity produced by wind. And you know, the territory of Brazil, which is almost the same of Australia in terms of the extension. Brazil has 80.5 million square kilometers, Australia around 8. And it's very favorable too for the production of electricity from wind. And we have, for example, this crisis in Europe now, and some consider that the crisis in the prices of energy nowadays has to do with the reduction of wind in Europe, the floodings in China, and the question of the coal, but also the drought in Brazil. But in the case of Brazil, the wind is considered very regular in the northeast of Brazil. And at the same time, this predictability about the wind in Brazil is also favorable for the potential of Brazil growing even more in terms of the production of wind. Well, of course, the question of the solar energy also in Brazil, as Australia, we have a huge territory for this. But in the case of Brazil, of course, we do not have as a territory which is as dry as in the case of Australia, which for solar purposes is even better. But at the same time, the fact that Brazil is a wetter country is better for the hydropower. But at the same time, we are also in an intertropical position, which is even more favorable for solar energy. So the purpose of Brazil, I would say, is to, starting from these already very high 48% of renewables in our matrix, is to reach around 80% of renewables in 2050. And for these, of course, solar, wind, biofuels, and now we come to the start of this discussion, the hydrogen, in which Brazil has just launched a national plan for hydrogen. We consider this an area which is a priority for innovation in Brazil. We are supporting this. We have developed the 3 infrastructure ports for the export of hydrogen. You know, the colleagues from the companies will elaborate on that. I will not do that, but you know that Brazil has Açu in Rio de Janeiro, has Pecém in Ceará, has Swap. So Brazil has many, I would say, opportunities for hydrogen, and in a way similar to the case of Australia, which is looking and facing, I would say, energy hungry markets in Asia. Brazil is also very well positioned for two large potential consumers of hydrogen, which is the United States and Europe, in a position which is more or less similar to the one that Australia has comparing to the importing countries in Asia. So we see this as a huge opportunity for the development of this already successful story of renewables in Brazil. Thank you very much, Christina. I hope I did not exceed my time.
No, thank you so much, Ambassador. There are a few questions already addressed to you. Maybe before I go to Rob, I'll ask one or two so that, because it's quite relevant to what you just said, so we don't go back to that. We've got Florence asking you that, well, she's saying that she heard Mercedes cars in Brazil, just like any other car, were running on sugarcane ethanol. Brazil's major, well, the only ethanol we have is based on sugarcane. We don't use corn like the US, so we don't actually have a problem with the food distribution. She said that they were fine, but have you observed any negative repercussions on the engine since then? And if it is, would you make it the only nation worldwide that already has zero emissions in transport? Can you claim that as Brazil in net zero emissions in transport?
Okay, thank you for the question. First, about the engines. It was a long story. In the beginning, the so-called purely alcohol ethanol engine was considered, well, that could suffer some corrosion and so on, but we managed to develop a technology in which this problem was completely solved. So the consumer in Brazil, in our fleet, we have 80% of this flex fuel engine. The consumer in Brazil is very happy with the engines because besides being a very good engine that we managed to develop, she has the opportunity to choose which fuel he or she will use when going to the gas station. So with the fluctuations of the prices of gas and the prices of ethanol, and of course the price of ethanol fluctuates too as a commodity. It also fluctuates well, in a way with variations of the price of sugar, because the same sugar cane which is produced for ethanol, which is used for producing ethanol, is used for producing sugar. But I would say that this, for my personal astonishment, it's a surprise that it's not so common in the world, the fact that we have a flex fuel engine in more cars. But in Brazil, it's 80%, is hugely successful. About zero emission, we know that this is not something that no country managed to reach that, because the presence of fossil fuels is inevitable in cars so far. Of course, we have the evolution for electric cars, but no country has a complete fleet of renewables source of energy as the source for engines in cars. But in the case of Brazil, what I can say is that we have an emission which is much lower than other countries because of ethanol. Because the emission of ethanol is much less carbon intensive than gasoline, than diesel, and other fossil fuels, than gas, natural gas. And for that reason, we have, in terms of the emission of the fleet in Brazil, a percentage of emission which is significantly lower than the average of the countries, because most of the countries use only fossil fuels for engines.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I might move on to Rob. I'd like to introduce now Rob Grant, who's the Director Energy of Fortescue Future Industries. He oversees the company's energy portfolio, including renewables and hydrogen. Rob, as we mentioned, is also president of the Australia-Brazil Chamber of Commerce. He lived in Brazil. He was former CEO of Pacific Hydro, which is Australia's leading clean energy utility operating wind, hydro and solar projects in many countries, including Chile and Brazil. Rob, would you care to maybe share with us some insights on FFI's overall strategy and their Brazil story?
Sure, thanks, Christina. And just also like to pay my respects to a bunch of people of the Noongar Nation, where I'm appearing from today in Perth, and to their elders past, present and emerging. Also like to say thank you to my fellow directors on the ABCC, and wonderful support from you, Chris, and the team to pull this together, and really appreciate all of the hard work that the ABCC director team puts to keep things alive. And I hope that this is, during COVID times, I hope this might be the last webinar we will have to attend, getting very close to the end, I feel. And also just finally, while I get a chance to say thanks to the Ambassador and welcome to Australia. It's wonderful to have you here, and we look forward to continuing the great collaboration that we've had between the Chamber and successive ambassadors over the last few years. Yeah, tonight I think the ambassador has stolen a lot of thunder because, and he's ideally placed to tell that story, but trying to tell the trio of links between Australia, Brazil, between renewable energy and now including green hydrogen, and why they all come together, and why Australia and Brazil are going to be a powerhouse and will continue to be a growing source of this new renewable and green hydrogen energy is going to resolve and solve the challenges we have around climate change. So the history of renewable energy in Brazil, as the Ambassador said, is clear. In fact, Australia also had a proud history in the early days of its electricity market in renewable energy, and at one stage we were also 80% renewable before we found brown coal in the Latrobe Valley and black coal in the Hunter Valley. We have shared large land masses, which matters from a scale production point of view, and I'll talk a bit about why that is important from a renewables point of view later on. And we have a comparative advantage in the fact that we just have this amazing ability to harness and harvest this high intensity renewable energy resources, both wind and solar. Obviously, Brazil has a lot more hydro still potential to extract, Australia less so, but the unit cost of wind and solar being what it is now will be shared, will be shared beneficiaries of that. And I hope that in the subsequent presentations from Marco and Tamara, we're going to hear a little bit about how the projects themselves come together. But a lot of what Fortescue Future Industries is doing, and a lot of what I have historically done in my own career, is in very defined way trying to both raise awareness and act upon the challenges of climate change. So having been in the renewable sector for 20 years, the parallels that I see between where we are today in green hydrogen and where we were in renewables 20 years is very clear. That back then we knew that through the production of more renewable energy, we were producing a product that the world needed in order to mitigate the impacts of climate change, but unfortunately it was twice the price of fossil fuel equivalent. And we were able to advocate to government and bring in great policy that was able to draw through a significant amount of new technology and new volume of renewable energy, and particularly in Australia, where, Chris, as you're saying, we've sort of doubled our renewable energy use, and that's only accelerating in a very short period of time, to the point now where the policy framework that's brought all that renewable energy to the Australian market is now really no longer needed, and we're just getting an economic displacement of old fossil fuels with new renewables. And the byproduct actually happens to be decarbonisation, and that's always been a great mantra and a great target for us in the industry, is to be both cleaner and cheaper. And so from that sort of analogy, you can see that where we are with, and because of those cost reductions in renewables, we are now able to start to think about creating the product that economies need to fully decarbonise, particularly parts of economies that can't be decarbonise with renewable electricity. And I'm talking about green hydrogen. So having renewable energy at the current price and continuing to fall allows us to think about making green hydrogen from it and starting to decarbonise sectors such as transportation, cement production, particularly steel production in our sector, and a number of other industrial feedstock uses for which hydrogen is already a pretty ubiquitous product. So that has led Fortescue to think about, well, how could it participate in this new industry? How can it take advantage of its geographic location and its experience in being a very large-scale producer in the resources sector and infrastructure? And how can we position ourselves to not only make ourselves a shining light for leading our core business around resources, leading that charge, but also how can we start to support our competitors with the products that they will need as they go down their decarbonisation journey. And so Fortescue last year set itself initially a 2050 decarbonisation Scope 1 and 2 target. It's now through August of last year, 2040, and it's now at March this year, a 2030 net zero target, which is well and truly industry leading. And just last month, we announced that our Scope 3 emission target is net zero by 2040. So we're really leaning in not only to resolving our own emission challenges, but also to helping our customers who make steel, particularly from iron ore, in how they resolve their targets. And we plan to do that by the development of very large-scale wind and solar projects, initially starting in the Pilbara. We need to offset or displace about 2 million tonnes, and probably going about 2.5 to 3 million tonnes on a business as usual unabated basis. So we've got a very substantial amount of diesel to replace in haul trucks, and we intend to do that with either renewable electricity charging batteries or renewable electricity making green hydrogen. And the idea is that we do that at a scale which brings the cost of renewable energy down further, and therefore brings the cost of green hydrogen down further. We believe that will be attractive to others in the Pilbara who do the same thing and who will also need to be decarbonising, and we would encourage them to set targets early for 2050. And we are then believing that having done that learning by doing process and generating, we believe, hopefully a competitive advantage in the production of the lowest cost green hydrogen in the world, then starting to sell that to third-party customers, whether it's our own competitors in the Pilbara or others overseas, particularly to the north, and our customers of iron ore who are needing to decarbonise their steel production. And then from there, Fortescue has put its foot on a number of large opportunities globally where we believe the same comparative advantage in scale production of renewables exists as we have in the Pilbara, and that leads us to Brazil, where we've made some announcements about a green hydrogen development projects both in the state of Rio and in Ceará, and very excited to be doing that and returning really to close the loop on my career at Pacific Hydro, where we had a very successful and enjoyable career in helping start the wind industry there over 10 years ago, and hopefully the same can be said shortly for the green hydrogen industry. And so look, I'll leave it there in terms of intro, and hopefully that's a good segue for Marco to come and talk about his exciting project.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's certainly a very ambitious target that Fortescue has set, and I hope it will motivate many other companies to do the same if it can be done. And thanks also for your constant participation in reducing emissions through all the different positions you've had before in all of this renewable world. So now it's my pleasure now to introduce Marco Staki Silva, who's a Brazilian here in Australia. He's got some very interesting news to share. He's the Chief Operations Officer at Energix, and he will be discussing their very huge green hydrogen project in Brazil. Thanks, Marco.
Okay, I will present a slide here for you. So Energix was the first project that signed an agreement with the Port of Pecém and with the government of Ceará in February this year. Right now, there are more projects there in the state of Ceará, in that particular port. including Fortescue. And that's very exciting because PECEM presents a lot of advantages for green hydrogen projects. But interesting enough, just as a very quick introduction about Energix, so our project there, the capacity of the project is 3.4 gigawatts constant, right? I'm going to use very common words for everybody to understand. And it is going to use more than 6 billion liters of water to produce around 615 million kilograms of green hydrogen per year to be exported, right? Like the great objective there is to use the blessed energy, the green energy from Brazil, which is very, very cheap, and the availability of water, and produce hydrogen for other countries. Like I consider hydrogen pretty much like a virtual transmission line. Like you use that to transport energy from one place where energy is relatively cheap to another place where energy is relatively expensive. But there are challenges, right? Like I don't want to talk only about Energix. I'm going to talk about Brazil as a whole. And there are advantages, of course, in producing energy in Brazil, and there are disadvantages. Well, 6 reasons that Brazil could become like probably one of the top 3 producers of green hydrogen by 2030. And when I told the governor of Ceará that Brazil could be the Saudi Arabia of green hydrogen, he started using that expression for every presentation. So now everybody says that Brazil is the Saudi Arabia of green hydrogen. But the reasons for that, there are 6 basic reasons. One is we have a lot of area in Brazil, like the same in Australia, but it's a very big country. Have plenty of space there to produce energy, to place hydrogen projects. But another very big advantage that it contains a lot of fresh water. Normally, people don't understand that, but to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen, you have to split the water, like the hydrogen from the oxygen. And you need energy for that, and you need a lot of water. Like you need around 9 liters of water per kilogram of hydrogen. So it's very good that you have availability of water, and it's relatively cheap, if not potentially free. You have a lot of installed energy capacity already, which is pretty good. Like, this is like pretty much 3 times more than Australia, 3.5 times more than Australia. And you have a big potential for more renewable energy. Like you have a capacity for around 145 gigawatts of wind along the coast. Someone told me that is around 700 gigawatts of offshore wind, which is on the sea. And solar is it could be a very big number because you have a lot of space and have very good solar conditions, but it's at least 1 terawatt of solar. And the renewable energy there has an interesting thing, is very good quality, right? We call it capacity factor. Like if the sun is shining during the day, right, it doesn't shine during the night, you believe that you would have like, I don't know, a 50% capacity factor. But because of efficiencies and so on, normally it's around 20-something%. And one of the highest capacity factors in the world for solar is in Brazil. And one of the highest for wind as well is in Brazil. So the combination of the two, like some places you have good wind but no solar, some places you have good solar but no wind. Brazil is good in both of them, a very high capacity factor for both of them. And the other one is like location, right? Like Brazil, and I will show a diagram for that. Brazil, like especially Port of PECEM, is pretty much like a central location to take hydrogen to the US or to Europe, Western Europe, and even to Africa, if there is a market there. It's a little bit further from Asia, but that's the location. But there are also challenges, right? Brazil doesn't come like that easy to do business there. And Rob and I had this experience with wind energy in Brazil with Pacific Hydro. We were successful, but not without our challenges. And every project in Brazil, we have some of these challenges here, or if not all of them. Number one is taxes. Like taxes in Brazil is probably the most complicated system in the world, and the taxes, if you add up everything, is very, very high. One advantage of PECEM has this area of export that reduces the taxes a lot, but no, that's not what happens everywhere else. There is I would say, a lack of port infrastructure. PECEM is excellent, but no, it's a single port there. But no other states that are blessed with renewable energy, you wouldn't have a good port there. You will have a port, but not a good port for hydrogen export. So you would have to build that infrastructure, which is very expensive and takes time. The other thing is the transmission network. Like a lot of Brazil is very interconnected. The capacity of bringing a lot of energy from one sub-market to the other is very limited. So let's say that you have a project in the Northeast and the energy comes from hydropower plants, wherever, something. It will be very far away. And then you have to pay a lot for this energy because of the transmission duties and fees. And also you probably think, oh, I want to have 1 gigawatt here. You will have to build a very long transmission line, which is very expensive to be able to bring all this energy to the place. So the connection, when you think about a project in Brazil, connection is very, here in Australia as well, connection is a very important point. Everybody knows that Brazil, I don't want to say that is very complicated as bureaucracy, but it does have impact in the cost and in the time schedule. Like things like getting a license, getting a permit, starting a company, everything there in Brazil takes time and money. So unfortunately, it could be a little bit more streamlined. And I will give you just a very quick example for that. Like until today, there is no framework, regulatory framework, for instance, for offshore wind. So Brazil has all this potential for offshore wind, but there is no way if someone can get a license for building one. So here we go. It would take a lot of time for them to fix that. The currency volatility, and I can tell you one thing, like from beginning of last year to this year, now the currency has already fluctuated a lot, but last year it went up like by 30%, like within like a period of 1 month. So I always bet against the Brazilian real, but we never know. It fluctuates, it goes up and down all the time. It affects, of course, any calculations, any financial models that you will calculate for Brazil. And the 6th point is, again, location, 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 because it's pretty far from Asia. And I believe Asia will be one of the first markets for hydrogen, like Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and even China. They're already talking about contracts for green hydrogen. It's starting small, but it will eventually become a very big deal. And I think they're going to be quicker, for instance, than the United States. So that's it. That's all. If anyone has any questions, I'm here to answer.
Thank you, Marco. Before I move on to Tamara, I can see we have a very active chat box. You mentioned water and how much water hydrogen requires for its production. And we've got a few people discussing the issue of water, saying that, hydrogen can be made from desalinated water, generally consumes far less water than coal power. What can you comment on the water usage for hydrogen, especially for a country like Australia, where in Brazil there's a lot more abundant water, but not here?
Sure. Yeah. I would say 2 things about that. It's the cost and efficiency, right? Like for you to desalinate water, you spend a lot of energy, and there is, of course, like an upfront cost. So you can do that, but there is already a lot of losses in the process of producing hydrogen and transmission of hydrogen, like let's say transportation of hydrogen. If you add also losses on energy on trying to desalinate water, then it's not very feasible, right? The hydrogen becomes very expensive and non-feasible. So in relation to, I'm not going to compare with coal and oil refining because they are dirty as a principle, but hydrogen will be better if you can produce hydrogen using less energy possible, right? That's the most efficient way. And it's very simple. The water has to be just fresh and relatively clean. Even like industrial water can be used, but not seawater. Unfortunately, not yet. Maybe in the near future, but not using water from the ocean or very dirty water. The hydrogen is not going to be very, very competitive.
Thanks, Marco. We'll come back to you soon. And now I would like to invite Tamara Kiraf, the Principal Commercial Hydrogen at Fortescue Future Industries, who's also connecting from Perth. She's the C4C Director in WA. She'll be explaining a little bit about Australia WA Hydrogen Hub model that FFI has. Welcome, Tamara.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to be joining you all virtually this evening. My name is Tamara Kiraf. I am Principal Commercial Hydrogen here at Fortescue Future Industries. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about the renewable energy projects that we have here at Fortescue that we have underway, as an example of some of the projects that are going on in Australia at the moment and the capabilities that Australia has to be a renewable energy powerhouse. So I'm just going to share my screen, if you'll bear with me. And hopefully you can all see that. So for those who may not be familiar with Fortescue, Fortescue is a global leader in the iron ore industry. We're leading by example to decrease emissions with, as Rob mentioned, a very ambitious goal to be carbon neutral across our operations by 2030, which is not all that far away. Using our large industrial platform of operating mine sites in the Pilbara, which is in the north of Western Australia, Fortescue will trial and demonstrate technologies in renewable green hydrogen, green ammonia, and green electricity to remove fossil fuels from across our business. With a current trajectory predicting that we would consume 1 billion litres of diesel per annum if no remedial action is taken, it's very clear that we do need to act now, which is exactly what we're doing. At Fortescue, we know renewable green hydrogen is the cleanest source of energy in the world and has the potential to replace up to 3/4 of global emissions if we improve the technology and have the scale. We are currently advancing projects across Australia, including Queensland, the Pilbara in WA, and Tasmania to build large-scale renewable energy and green hydrogen production capacity, as well as assessing a portfolio of hydropower, geothermal, wind and solar assets globally, as Rob touched on. Already, FFI has identified projects in renewable energy that could lead to some 300 gigawatts of power, which is an absolutely staggering amount. We believe that the major steel, truck, train, ship, and mobile plant industries can be operated with renewable, environmentally friendly energy. Already, our green team has been successful in testing combustion of ammonia in a locomotive fuel with a pathway to achieving completely renewable green fuel. We have also completed the design and construction of a combustion testing device for large ship engines, and pilot testing for that is underway. Our team has finalised the design of a next generation ore carrier that will consume renewable green ammonia. And we have designed and constructed a hydrogen powered haul truck, the large mining trucks, as you can see the old version on the screen here, and it will consume renewable green ammonia. We have also designed and constructed a hydrogen powered drill rig, which is used in mining operations across the world at the moment, the old version, for technology demonstration, and testing for this is underway. And finally, we celebrated the successful production of high purity green iron from Fortescue ores at low temperature in a continuous flow process. So these initiatives have all been tested by Fortescue using commercial scale equipment to prove that the demand for green electricity and green hydrogen and green ammonia could one day be as large as the fossil fuel industry. So the key to Fortescue's target of achieving carbon neutrality by 2030 is our investment in renewables via, at the moment, the Pilbara Energy Connect. So Fortescue is investing US $700 million in energy transmission infrastructure and solar gas hybrid generation to deliver low-cost power to our Pilbara operations. Fortescue will also benefit from a 60 megawatt solar generation facility at our Chichester hub operation, which is also in the Pilbara. This hub is owned and operated by Alinta Energy, and this project is expected to displace around 100 million litres of diesel per year. We are also investing $32 million into an Australian first demonstration of zero emissions mobility at a mining operation. This project will see the deployment of 10 full-size custom-built hydrogen coaches, a picture of one of which you can see on your screen there, which will replace the existing fleet of diesel coaches we currently have at our Christmas Creek mine site. And this project is well underway, and that change out of the vehicles will happen at the end of this year. The project will be supported by the installation of Australia's first and therefore largest hydrogen refueling station, which will harness renewable electricity from the Chichester Solar Gas Hybrid project to generate green hydrogen on site. So effectively, it's like having a service station on site, which only runs on renewables and produces hydrogen, which is fantastic. In addition to these projects, FFI has announced a proposed green hydrogen plant in Belle Bay, which is in northern Tasmania. This project could be one of the world's largest renewable green hydrogen plants when commissioned, creating a significant export market for green hydrogen from Australia. Australia is very well positioned for the development of a green hydrogen industry due to the availability of low cost, reliable, renewable energy and excellent port and water infrastructure. This project particularly envisages the construction of a green hydrogen plant with green ammonia production capacity of 250,000 tonnes per year, which is for both domestic and international export. And this one is targeted for investment decision by the Fortescue board this year for 2021. Earlier this year, we also announced phase 1 of the Global Green Energy Manufacturing Centre in Queensland. This project will be the world's largest electrolyzer, renewable industry and equipment factory, and the first step in a series of projects that will continue to transform regional Australia through green industry manufacturing. Stage 1 of this 6-stage project will establish Australia's first multi-gigawatt scale electrolyzer factory with an initial capacity of 2 gigawatts per annum, and that alone is already more than doubling current global production. So when commencing a project in Australia, it's important to have a positive relationship with the local traditional owner groups and regional landowners and local communities, as well as the local, state and federal governments. Fortescue has a very strong process on creating thriving communities, and to do this, we insist on the following in all of the communities that we operate in. So equal education outcomes for boys and girls driving employment equality, no modern slavery in their formal and informal workforces, zero forced, bonded or compulsory labour, zero forced marriage and zero child marriage. So those are standards that we maintain wherever we operate around the world. What does the future look like? Zero emissions energy needs to be available at an industrial global scale and at a price that competes with fossil fuels. That's when the world will begin the journey realistically to become zero carbon. Our vision is to make renewable green energy the most globally traded seaborne energy commodity in the world. And FFI has announced plans to produce 15 million tonnes of green hydrogen by 2030. It's only 9 short years away. We know that there will be many key markets for green hydrogen in the coming decade, and by building on Fortescue's existing supply chain capabilities and market access, we see this as being a really exciting opportunity to not only participate in, but on our behalf be at the forefront of developing an export market for green hydrogen from Australia. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tamara. Thank you very much. I should say at this stage that we're still waiting for the Honourable Damien Drum to join us, but he's stuck at a committee meeting. He will be joining at the end, hopefully. Well, that was a very optimistic and absolutely incredible presentation on the plans of what FFI has. But I'd like to ask a question before we go to the audience and all the questions we received prior to the commencement of this event. A lot of skeptics on hydrogen talk about the cost and how far it is still from us to being able to produce green hydrogen at a viable price. What does Rob and Marco and yourself, Tamara, have to say about that? How far are we from being able to capitalize on an affordable green hydrogen, not blue or any other type of hydrogen? And how do you see that the market demand will then be able to speed the process?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to start with that one. So realistically, zero emissions energy needs to be available at an industrial scale and at a price that is comparable to fossil fuel options in order for it to be realistically able to be taken up globally quickly. So as renewable energy becomes less expensive than fossil fuel, that's when we'll reach the tipping point. That's when the world will begin its journey to being zero carbon. And what will actually bring us there is being able to manufacture at scale, which is something that Fortescue in particular is very focused on, and using electrolysis, which is a very proven technology, will start driving down the cost of green hydrogen.
Anybody else commenting, Rob?
Yeah, look, it's one of those sort of 10-year overnight success stories. We look back on renewables and sort of think, oh, that was fantastic and how easy, etc. But the reality was, as I said earlier, we were producing something back then which was twice the price of the coal-fired generation. Government recognised that having more renewables in the network was going to be ultimately a good thing, and put in place the right policies to drive through or pull through demand, which led to volume significant volume increase, and particularly in manufacturing economies of scale around solar panels and wind equipment, very rapid and significant cost reduction. And we expect the same to happen in electrolysis. And, once the cost curve and that learning curve for renewable energy started to approach and then go past the cost of thermal generation, then, as we're experiencing on the East Coast in Australia and many places around the world, and here in WA, the consumer understands that they can make a difference. So they start installing their own generation with solar panels on rooftops because they can afford it and they can see the payback very quickly. And at an industrial scale, large-scale developers and utilities start installing large projects like we've seen around Australia and start to push out the thermal generation very quickly as an economic NPV positive activity. And that's really why we're seeing such a rapid and disorderly disruption to the electricity market on the East Coast. And we expect the same story to be the case in green hydrogen when we get the economies of scale, manufacturing scale up in electrolysis, pushing prices down, leading to more projects, more supply, more demand, and this sort of, as we call it, for us, this flywheel of activity to ultimately be delivering, we hope, a alternative fuel to the existing fossil fuels. But it is important to note that, if we are going to meet our 2050 and hopefully earlier net zero targets under the Paris commitments, we need to be producing the alternative solutions, whether it's electricity or through green hydrogen. So we will regulate towards this. And one of the things is that investors in investors in shareholders in most organisations these days are requiring companies to show their pathway. And so even if it was more expensive, the investor market, the capital markets, and the regulatory environment will force these fuels and these solutions to be brought to market probably much quicker than many people expect. So we're very optimistic and are certainly happy to continue to advocate to government-wide. Setting a 2050 target is critical, and then setting in place a clear policy pathway to help us get there.
Thank you, Rob. Marco?
And just to complement everything, we are talking about economies of scale and so on, but what will create this demand, right? You need some kind of demand. And there are two components there, I think. One is going to be some kind of a government incentive or carbon credits or something like that. But there is also something that I think it's interesting, is how to use this hydrogen in a way that it's already competitive, right? If you think about the demand for hydrogen, there is what they call mobility, right? There is a lot of uses that you can talk about, but none of them is developed enough to create the demand today. But there is one use that it's very already interesting, which is power. So you can compete, hydrogen can already compete in many ways with diesel power generation. So let's say you are in an island in the Pacific Ocean, or you are in the Maldives, for instance. One of the few options they have there is to have diesel gensets, right? Diesel generation. And the cost is horrendous, it's $300 per megawatt hour or more. Hydrogen can already be competitive against that. So you create a demand by using hydrogen to produce energy, right? And I even call it power arbitrage, because you can produce hydrogen very cheaply in Australia and in Brazil, and then you transport that to places where power generation is very expensive, and voila, you have a power arbitrage. So that's probably, in my opinion, the beginning of creation of the demand. And of course, you can probably create an artificial demand by government requests or somehow carbon credits to make fossil fuel less competitive, or end of subsidies. Fossil fuel still has a lot of subsidies. So wherever happens that you create an artificial demand, that helps what Rob said about the economies of scale. That cost curve, it will go down definitely. The cost today of electrolysis equipment is still very high. And we calculate that it can go 1/3 of the price in 5 years from now. So there will be a lot of options for hydrogen to become extremely competitive against fossil fuel in many applications, including mobility, including power.
Thanks, Marco. I have a few questions for the ambassador, but there's one that popped up on the Q&A that's relevant to what you mentioned about a certain mechanism or a carbon pricing that might actually improve or create more demand even. Zoe's asking, how important do you see the role of a functioning global carbon market in driving down the cost of green hydrogen and increasing uptake?
Well, it's certainly the most economically efficient way to achieve the net zero target, but there are certain markets around the world where it's politically unpalatable. So we have to work with other mechanisms, whether it's direct demand pool policies, which mandate certain volumes of green hydrogen by a particular date into certain sectors of the economy, or just straight regulation. So, I think there are multiple pathways to get volumes up, as Marco says, to get that demand in, and that's why, Fortescue, we're creating our own demand by being our own customer, by having a 2030 target, having to offset those 2.2 million tonnes, 20 years earlier than anybody else, and learn how to do that and create the technology that can achieve it, which is basically just compressing the time frame which the rest of the economies and globally will have to go through. But look, I would say certainly Tamara was talking about the Tasmania project. It's a bit of a strange market. It's completely nascent. It's neither demand nor supply constrained. There is a significant pent-up demand, and I think a bit like in the early days of iron ore, a bit like in the early days of LNG, the large off-takers, particularly in Asia, are looking for quality suppliers, certainty of supply, in order to then have them and their countries commit to the very significant retooling and investment in infrastructure that will be needed at their end to replace the transportation and the power generation fleets that exist there that currently run off fossil fuels. So I think once we start, and that's the role of what Fortescue Future Industries is doing, is to try to create that supply story, same sort of high quality, reliable delivery story that we have in iron ore, in the green hydrogen space.
Thank you, Rob. I suppose the other thing is when there's more stringent heavy transport emission standards being set all over the world, that's going to obviously drive more demand. And the standards governing hydrogen being harmonized, I don't think they are yet. And the regulatory barriers being removed would help as well. Okay, I have a few questions to the ambassador. In fact, I received a message from the former Brazilian ambassador to Australia, Sergio Moreira Lima, who's saying, first of all, he's conveying his enthusiasm and the best wishes to Marco and to Tamara. And he would like to ask, first of all, for you to explain the next steps for the project implementation in Brazil and the expectations from the ambassador's point of view here in relations to the Brazilian counterparts and local authorities for the hydrogen projects. So maybe you can answer that first, Ambassador, and then Marco and Tamara can talk about the next steps of implementation of those two projects they mentioned in Brazil.
Thank you, Christina. Well, first, it's a pleasure to receive the question of Sergio. Sergio was a great ambassador here in Australia, a great supporter of the bilateral relations, and also a great supporter of the projects on renewables between Brazil and Australia. So it's a pleasure. And you know that we have lots of opportunities to continue this work. My view is that we have, and this debate shows very well, the similarities between Brazil and Australia. The fact that even in renewables, in characteristics of the territory, of the question of the exposure to solar sources, to the solar energy, the availability of wind, the huge territories that we have many similarities. And these, for most people in the past, would recommend, well, we are competitors, we could be rivals. But the conclusion, as we had in agriculture, and telling very frankly in the debates of the WTO and the former and the old GATT, is that the debate between and the coordination of positions between Brazil and Australia is the most adequate way to use these similarities, these characteristics that Brazil and Australia share, in order to best address all those issues. So I'm very hopeful that Brazil and Australia will manage to develop a really a strategic dialogue on these issues. And of course, the question of the renewables is central to this dialogue, because Brazil and Australia are huge powers in terms of agriculture and mining. And of course, these are two activities which are very much emphasized in all the debate of of climate change, of the effects on the environment. And since Brazil and Australia have lots to show in terms of the advances that they promoted in terms of protecting the environment, developing renewable sources of energy, the opportunity for a dialogue between the two countries regarding I would say, the intersection of these three major sectors: agriculture, mining, and energy, with the question of the adequate protection of the environment and the reduction of emissions, is central. So I'm happy to listen to the question of Sergio. We all have the same, I would say, purpose, which is to strengthen the relations between Brazil and Australia, and specifically in this question of the future of the renewables in the two countries. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, Sergio, for the intervention.
Thanks, Ambassador. Who wants to start on the next steps? Marco, you want to talk a bit more about the next steps? And also, I suppose, another question that the ambassador in Brazil, Sergio, asked: what are the expectations of foreign investors concerning the regulatory process you mentioned in Brazil by local authorities? How can it affect the competitiveness?
Sure. In a project like that, you have pretty much three activities that have to go in parallel, and they are going to converge in a milestone in the future called financial close. This is when you start building the project, right? So everything before building the project are development activities, and you have to do a lot of studies. You have a lot of environmental and technical and commercial studies, and everything put together is a feasibility study, right? So you have to prepare a feasibility study. You have to apply for permits and licenses, which in Brazil is like a LP, LI, and LO, right? Licença prévia, licença de instalação, licença de operação. And we have one challenge more than Fortescue, which is we also have to raise the funding, financing and equity and so on. So we also, in our case particularly, we also have a hydrogen power plant, sorry, but we also have to have the renewable energy that will provide energy to that. So in parallel, there are a lot of activities related to the renewable energy projects. So everything will converge to the financial close, which we calculate is going to be 18, maybe 19, 20 months from now, depending on funding. And then the other step will be start construction, which for renewable energy like wind and solar is pretty quick, relatively quick. And a hydrogen power plant, a hydrogen plant, normally you have the main equipment, which is the electrolysis. 3.4 gigawatts is pretty much 3 times more than the capacity of the biggest company in the world that produces electrolyzers, like per year. So they would need like 3 years to build the equipment for us. So there would be a challenge as well to build a project as big as that without the equipment supplier having the capacity to build the equipment for us, to manufacture the equipment for us. But these are a lot of challenges that we have to go through, and I'm pretty sure that any project, any hydrogen project in Brazil will go through exactly the same challenges.
Thanks, Marco. Robert, Tamara, do you want to comment on the next stages for FFI in Brazil?
Rob, if you'd like to take that one for Brazil, I was going to talk a bit more holistically about next steps, but Brazil-centric is definitely your domain.
I think it's same as Marco, that doing the feasibility analysis, going through mapping the approvals processes, stakeholder engagement, and obviously customer and demand side for the product. But yeah, it's a sort of traditional and quite similar sort of process. I think, from our point of view, we're interested in working with the existing wind developers in Ceará, and we come there with a green hydrogen production aspiration, not necessarily a green energy development aspiration. So there's already a very active and successful wind auction market. There's already multiple ways through which new large loads like green hydrogen can procure energy, and we're working actively with a number of the developers up there that are developing those projects. So, working in collaboration with them on their approvals and their feasibility work as well as part of our own activity.
Thank you.
Tamara, did you want to talk about the same steps here in Australia?
Certainly are similar in Australia, but what I was going to say is that with the timing of where we're coming up to now with COP26 on the very near-term horizon, really what is achieved at COP26 is going to be so important for the future of renewables, not only in Australia but also in Brazil, which I know both our countries are attending, but also the world. So we're going to be making a really strong case for greater investment in green hydrogen at COP26, but also for the adoption of a global accreditation system for hydrogen, which currently there is no universally accepted stringent accreditation system. And we see that as going to be something that's really important in making sure that it doesn't factor in fugitive methane emissions and other disparities that will allow mistruths to be perpetuated going forward, and instead of a true global net zero target.
Thanks, Tamara. Christopher Wright is asking, what are the barriers to rapid adoption of green hydrogen, both in Australia and in Brazil, and what can be learned from each country to help the others improve rapid adoption rates? Who wants to have a go at that? Have you encountered barriers for the rapid adoption in Brazil, Marco, or it's too early to discuss that, I suppose?
To be honest, it's not that there is a barrier there, it's just that there is no incentive per se. So Brazil, for instance, for mobility already has the ethanol, as the ambassador said. You have a lot of options there. Energy there is relatively cheap. You don't have like the opportunity to displace. I mean, you do have a little bit of opportunity to displace diesel genset in the Amazon forest, because you have a lot of remote areas there that only can be accessed by diesel genset. So you do have a little bit of opportunities in Brazil. You might have some opportunities for heavy trucks, maybe for bus fleets, but there is no market yet. I think like there are more opportunities here in Australia than in Brazil, because here you have very dirty fuel to produce energy, right? You have coal power plants. You can literally displace a whole coal power plant here in Australia with diesel if diesel is competitive and if there is no subsidy for coal here. Like the problem in Australia is the coal industry, let's call lobby or wherever they have there, that it's very hard to break. But if you could, you would probably have a very interesting project if you could displace a coal power plant with hydrogen, green hydrogen here in Australia. In Brazil, a little bit less this kind of opportunity, but again, in other countries, you have a very big opportunity to do that against diesel and against very expensive coal using green hydrogen. So from the mobility side of it, there is still a long way to go. I cannot say if it's going to be 5 years from now or 20 years from now that we are going to have a market for mobility, but I'm 100% sure that one day, every single vehicle, it could be airplanes, cars, trucks, buses, trains, helicopters, wherever you think of, it will be running hydrogen.
Thank you. I've got Ed. You've sort of partially answered one of the questions from Ed, who's connected from Germany. He's actually asking if there are still fossil fuel subsidies, whether it's in Brazil and in Australia, that become a barrier to progressing further on renewables. Ambassador, do we have, in Brazil, we don't seem to have fossil fuels incentives anymore or any type of support to the fossil fuel industry, is it?
No, we don't have for fossil fuels. And it's curious because we manage, and this is interesting, we manage to have all this policy of, I would say, developing renewables, even after the great discovery of oil in Brazil, which was around the mid-2000s, which was around 2005, 2006, we discovered what we call the pre-salt, large reserves of oil in Brazil. And even with that, which made Brazil if I'm not wrong, the 9th producer of oil in the world, we continued with the policy of developing technologies and support for renewables. But we do not have the subsidies for oil. What we have for some time was the subsidies for sugar, which is, I would say, almost universal, if you allow me the comment on the specific nature of the sugar industry. But in some of the times, the subsidies for sugar not necessarily favored ethanol because the production was alternative. So in terms of the larger production of sugarcane, yes, but not I would say the direction of the use of sugarcane, not for ethanol, but for sugar. So we do not have the subsidies for fossil fuels in Brazil.
And for the renewables, what are the incentives? Because I remember when you were in Brazil and with Pacific Hydro, I'm pretty sure in the beginning there were lots of incentives for the wind industry to become stronger in the beginning, right?
Yes, in the case of the solar energy, we cut all the tariffs for imports of equipments for solar energy. In the case of wind, I don't know if all the equipment is free of tariffs and border, but we also consider these a priority for projects innovation. And of course, this has the support of public funds. And telling frankly, the construction of hydropower, it's not a question of subsidies, it's a question of huge investment of the state. In the case of Brazil, you know, for example, Itaipu, we have together with the government of Paraguay, because it's in the border, the river is in the border between Brazil and Paraguay. And it was a huge financial engineering in order to have the resource to build the largest dam, the largest hydroelectricity power station in the world. Of course, this is not even a question of subsidies, it's a question of how to build the infrastructure, which is managed by the government. And in the case of ethanol, the incentives were huge for the development in the beginning of the technology of engines and the production of ethanol. And that's why we have nowadays, I think, in part, of course, because also the competence, the productivity of our companies which entered the field of the production of engines for ethanol. But that's why we can say nowadays the flex fuel engine in Brazil is so efficient and so admired by the Brazilians and so used by them.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We're running out of time. I think I might have time for just one or two more. Anna is asking, especially to FFI and you, Marco, what do you see any opportunities between Australia and Brazil in developing bilateral collaboration on renewable energy, on R&D, in research and development?
I can mention at least one R&D thing that might be interesting, because the major challenge for hydrogen is the transportation side of it, right? So how to transport it over water, I call it, like in a boat, in a ship. And there are a lot of options today. You know, you have ammonia, you have liquefied hydrogen, you have compressed hydrogen if you want to. You have LOHC, which is liquid organic hydrogen carrier, which is basically a toluene. People are talking about methanol and so on. So there are a lot of options, but someone will break the technology in a way that transportation will be very efficient, very cheap, and very dense. That's a major problem, is the volumetric density of hydrogen. If we can solve that problem, hydrogen will be even cheaper and even easier to distribute around the world. And that's, I think, where the R&D collaboration between Australia and Brazil will be interesting, because both of our countries will be big exporters, number one, and the distances will be long. So that would be something that we could probably find a solution together, maybe.
Thank you.
Yeah, probably just add to that, you know, the experience that Brazil has had with alternative fuels such as ethanol. You know, ethanol is really just liquid sunshine, really, produced from sugarcane growing, and the same will be for green hydrogen converted to green ammonia. So we believe that there's a very significant market in the early years for, you know, low speed, low RPM engines, such as locomotives and ships, to be co-burning, co-firing, or fully burning green ammonia. And we're trialling that in our own ships at Fortescue. We have eight ore carriers of our own that we can trial that on. And you know, the experience and of flex fuel over the years in Brazil is something that we've already had a pretty close look at with our green industry team about how to integrate this technology. So I think there's and look, continuing the great collaboration, probably less so during COVID, but the great collaboration of Brazilian students coming to Australia and doing their PhDs and masters, and hopefully we can encourage them to be bringing some of their knowledge and expertise over here and putting it into research programs in Australian universities.
Thank you, Rob. And Andrew is asking, is there any opportunity to help Brazilian remote communities using some of the know-how from Australia in remote areas, utilizing the renewable developments in the regional areas?
Yeah, look, I mean, we have the same issues here in Western Australia and other parts of the country around how to support remote communities that are currently quite simply just burning diesel because it's this most simplest and not reliable solution. But the ability for us to in now that we're building these large renewable energy projects in remote locations for the first time, because we're bringing the project to the market rather than needing all that energy to go to a large city, for example. We can either be directly connecting them, but probably more likely is just deploying the technology, which is far more prevalent today around integrated solar battery hybrid systems. And we're already seeing that either through the work that we're doing directly at Fortescue or the likes of the local utilities here in Western Australia, particularly Horizon Energy, on displacing lead diesel. It's in remote communities, so it's quite I think it's quite prevalent and growing.
Thank you, Rob. And I think I'll finish with a question to the ambassador. We discussed how targets can assist in the emissions reductions journey, and Brazil has set its targets. And Flavia is asking, what do you think has been the impact of Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro regarding the deadline mentioned in the beginning that I mentioned about the target for 2050 and 2030?
Well, we announced recently that we have increased our targets, increased in the sense that to have it even better than we had before for 2030. And also reaffirmed our commitment to zero net emission for 2050. So it's, I would say, it's something that the Brazilian society and Brazilian government are I would say unanimously, convinced that the question of the environment is very important. The conscience of the question of the environment in Brazil is so strong, and we have this privilege of having a matrix, an energy matrix, which is already so favorable to our purpose of reaching those targets. The fact that Brazil is already 48% in its energy matrix already provided by renewables is something very important that we have as a wonderful, as I said, starting point to reduce even more. But we are convinced that we are completely able to reach those targets.
Thank you very much. I would like to then now close the event by thanking you especially, Ambassador. We hope to see you face to face. We'd like to do a welcome event very soon with you in Canberra or here in Sydney. Thank you for sharing all your insights and very valuable information. Also, thank you to Marco, Tamara, and Rob for talking to us about the projects and the incredible opportunities with hydrogen, green hydrogen, both for Australia and for Brazil in creating export markets and collaborating together in this. So thanks also to the audience, very participant today, and for contributing to the discussions. We're looking forward to Australia and Brazil collaborating, as I mentioned, especially in the area of renewables, very important area for all of us. And if you wish to receive from either the Australia-Brazil Chamber or Coalition Conservation our newsletters and invitations, please just go to our website and sign up as a supporter. I'd like to wish everyone a great night and see you at our next event. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank
Chris.
you.
Right. Good
See you
night.
soon. Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.